for having me. It's a pleasure to be here virtually and to see so many familiar faces in the audience. I'm going to share my screen, so we're going to have a visual portion of this. So hopefully you can see that now. Okay. So first thing, Danny, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And Lorena, also thank you in introducing this for doing a land acknowledgement. And that's particularly appropriate today, as it is a day that I was raised with as Columbus Day and has been replaced in Evanston by Indigenous Peoples Day fairly recently. And I'm really thrilled about that. You'll see that I think it's particularly appropriate that we're doing this talk on this day. So I want to tell you a story of basically a book report that got way out of hand. There's a movie about Dune, which is a well-known novel by Frank Herbert, a sci-fi novel. And there's a movie that was supposed to come out in December, and it's been pushed back. So it's going to come out in 2021. But I was talking to an editor that I work with at a magazine called N+1, and he suggested it might be nice to write something about Dune. So basically, can you do a book report about Dune? And I thought, yeah, this will be like a nice, easy thing in the summer. There's one Dune novel that I've read. It's the first one. It's the one that, people who've read it have usually read. There's some others. Maybe I'll read those. I'll, dunk my head in the Dune world and I'll see what there is to see. Part of the reason I was excited to take on this assignment, which I thought was going to be fairly short, was that I'm a historian, and as a historian, I'm particularly interested in U.S. foreign relations and U.S. empire. These are the covers of the two books I've written. And I had a hunch about Dune. And the hunch was this, and it was derived from a cultural theorist named Edward Said, who did a lot of writing about British literature. And what he kind of noticed about British literature, and we're talking classics of Victorian literature, is that there was a way in which, an often unacknowledged way in which, the theme of empire haunted books that didn't even seem like they were supposed to be about empire. So like Jane Eyre turns out to be, once you read it the right way, all about empire. And I suspected that you could probably say something about a lot of the literature that was popular in the United States, not British literature in the 19th century, but US literature in the 20th century. There's certainly a lot of quite popular fiction that writes about empires, but writes about them in a kind of vague and abstract sense. They're set, as in the Star Wars universe, in galaxy far away. And I thought, I know that people like George Lucas are interested in empires just in a sort of abstract storytelling way, but also the United States is itself a fairly powerful imperial country with a lot of imperial entanglements. And I bet that those show up in literature in specific ways, not just in general ways. So I just had this hunch that, in Frank Herbert's universe, that there was going to be a story that I could tell as a historian. And evidence to think that this might be right is, the imperial interaction that the United States government had with indigenous people on the North American continent totally shows up all over in culture, right? So you had just generations of kids growing up, reading James Fenimore Cooper, playing cowboys and Indians. I mean, there's so many ways in which so many aspects of US culture are really about that kind of imperial encounter. And so the question I had, or the hypothesis I had, or the guess I had, is that you could probably say something also about the United States' post-1945 imperial interactions with other parts of the world. And I'd done a little research on this already. I'd done some writing about a group of comic books that were extremely popular in the 1940s and 1950s, these Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comic books. And it turns out that not only were they enormously popular, but they're all about the ducks going out to countries in the global south and Asia and Africa, getting money and coming back. I mean, these are, themes that deserve to be explored. And I got really interested in that. I also wrote a little bit about Star Wars, which I discovered was really about Vietnam. And George Lucas, was thinking very carefully about Vietnam as he was thinking through the Star Wars universe. And once you see that, you can kind of map elements from the films onto that political situation. So the question then became for me, what about Dune? What's going on with Dune? And it felt, a nice time to answer it because on the one hand, there's this movie that's about to come out. Here's a screenshot from it. On the other hand, partly because the movie's coming out, but also for other reasons and reasons we can explore in the Q&A. Dune, a novel that came out first in 1965, has resurged and recently this year has appeared at the top of various mass market bestseller lists. So outselling books that have been sold, that have been published this year and last year, is this book that is, came out more than 50 years ago. Partly that's the pandemic, just a lot of people felt like it was the right time for Dune. So it's having a weird cultural moment that I think goes beyond the film. And it seemed like it was a good time to talk about it. So I won't assume that everyone in this audience has read Dune. My experience is that the world is divided into most people who have not read Dune and then a vocal minority who have read it more than 3 times. So whichever you are, I welcome, and I hope this will be interesting. Briefly, what the novel is about this off-worlder named Paul Atreides who comes to what seems to be an inhospitable desert planet called Arrakis, or colloquially Dune. And it seems like it's going to be an extraordinarily difficult place to be. It's on the periphery of the galaxy. It's valuable because there's some sort of mineral-like substance called spice that can be mined from it that's extraordinarily valuable. But other than that, it's a really difficult place to live. As Paul Atreides goes to Dune, he starts to feel connected to it. He feels connected to the environment, and he particularly comes to be connected to the indigenous people of Dune, the Fremen. And he ends up leaving the political situation that he came into, where he's a sort of well-established young man with a political future, joining the Fremen, taking on a Fremen name, and then leading a Fremen insurgency to overthrow the Galactic Imperium. And that's how the book ends. So it's a kind of a wild book. When it first came out, it's also a very long book. And when it first came out, Frank Herbert published it in serial in this science fiction magazine called Analog, and then wanted to publish the whole thing as a single novel. And that was a difficult thing to do. The thing was, if you have a sense of word counts, it was 215,000 words, which turned out to be, some nearly 600 pages. And publishers were not interested in taking it. It was weird, it was long, it was ungainly. The plot didn't really resemble a lot of plots of other science fiction books at the time. The place that Frank Herbert finally found that was willing to publish it is a publisher called Chilton, mainly known for its auto repair manuals. And the joke was that they were used to publishing books that were quite thick. And so they published it with a very low print run, and it didn't sell out. And so basically the book sort of, like a lot of books, it got published and not a lot of people read it, except for this. First, it started winning science fiction awards. And then more importantly, it started picking up a cult following, particularly on college campuses. There was something subversive, there was something transgressive, there was something exciting about this book. And indeed, if you looked at the themes that are covered in the book, they're kind of wild. So it deals with, in a really active way, ecology. The book is about coming to terms with the ecology of this planet. And the Fremen are, have all kinds of stuff going on. They conduct orgies as a sort of regular matter of statecraft. There's a lot of mysticism coming from all directions in the book. Characters meditate, and that meditation becomes really important. And there are psychedelic drugs. The characters take psychedelic drugs. This novel seemed to capture a lot of what was going to come out of the counterculture in the next couple of years. And it seemed to get there pretty early, given that it was first published in serial in 1963. Partly for that reason, a lot of screenwriters got really interested in making a movie about Dune. Dune became the unscalable Himalayan peak of counterculture in space movies. First this Chilean surrealist Alejandro Jodorowsky was supposed to direct it. This is a poster that corresponding to the film that as he was going to make it. You can see in the back Salvador Dali, who was going to be in the cast. Ridley Scott then tried to make it. Jodorowsky failed. Ridley Scott then tried to make it. He found it too difficult and ended up making Blade Runner instead. Director after director just felt like this was the movie they wanted to make. It finally got made by David Lynch in 1984. It was a huge, much anticipated movie, enormous budget. It was also a flop. It was partly because David Lynch had a rough cut of about 4 to 5 hours, and the studios made him cut it down to 2 hours, and the movie got kind of incomprehensible in that. So Dune was exciting to a lot of directors to film. It seemed like it captured something of the age that they really wanted to, engage with, but it was also very difficult to film. And there's an irony here, because the way that Dune shows up on the screen is not through this, these famous attempts by Jodorowsky and Ridley Scott, or this famous flop by David Lynch, but it gets in there through the back door, because a lot of the themes of Dune get picked up in another major movie, Star Wars. And I won't go through all of the many examples, but fans have really spent a lot of time on Dune versus Star Wars, and noticed that George Lucas was quite clearly reading Dune, especially in the early drafts. The economy of Star Wars turns on something called spice, which is exactly the substance that is so important in Dune. And more importantly, Star Wars tells the story of a young man on a peripheral desert planet who wields a blade and masters mystical arts, and then comes to overthrow a galactic empire. That's the plot of Dune. That's the plot of Star Wars. And this is a sort of deep cut reference cartoon that deals with some of the highly specific words and images that are in each. I'm happy to explain some of those in the Q&A if you'd like. So anyway, Dune is weird in that it is enormously successful as a franchise, but its success has been almost entirely rooted to writing. It's the novels that are successful, and particularly the first novel. By the time Frank Herbert died in 1986, the entire series, anchored by that first novel, which is just called Dune, the rest all have Dune in the title, sold some 35 million copies, which, if you know about books, is absolutely extraordinary. And it is also extraordinary that Dune, as a literary franchise, is back with us today, also topping bestseller lists. So, on to the question. Is the Edward Said type hypothesis right? Is there some backstory here, or something that, some connection to empire that goes beyond just the fact that this is set in outer space between warring empires? That was a question I had, and it did not take me too long to realize that there was, in fact, an enormous amount to say. As I started reading into Frank Herbert's life and biography, one thing I discovered is that before he was able to support himself via the success of Dune as a novelist, he worked as a political writer, and he was in the West Coast. He was from Washington State, and he'd grown up on a socialist commune. But nevertheless, he'd taken a political journey and become a fairly conservative Republican. So he worked as a speechwriter and a political aide in a broader sense for a number of Republican political candidates from the West Coast. The most important one that he worked for, who brought him to Washington, was this person named Guy Cordon, who is the Oregon senator who was running for re-election. So Frank Herbert worked for him in Washington, worked on his re-election campaign, a campaign for which Richard Nixon stumped for the senator. It was ultimately unsuccessful. But this is, an extraordinarily conservative man who was mainly concerned with wresting logging out of the purview of the federal government so that logging companies could more directly and more easily go about their business. And Frank Herbert was quite influenced by him. The catch here, the thing that makes Cordon's career interesting, and particularly interesting from my perspective, is that Cordon had gotten into politics mainly to defend logging firms, but because he's in the Senate, and because he'd been in the Senate for quite some time by the time that Frank Herbert started working for him in the 1950s, he'd risen through the ranks, and he'd become the chair of the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee. So what does the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee do? It oversees, from the Senate, the Department of the Interior, and it also oversees insular affairs. What are insular affairs? Well, the United States at the time, still now, had a not enormous, but fairly substantial overseas empire with overseas territories. The islands, that's why it's called insular affairs, island affairs. And so Guy Cordon was the top-ranking person in the Senate for overseeing the United States' colonial empire, which at the time included overseas territories like Hawaii and Alaska, which were not yet states, as well as American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, which at that point had a different political identity. This was a big deal for Guy Cordon. He traveled a lot to the Pacific territories. Here he is bedecked in Hawaiian lei. And it was a big deal for Frank Herbert, too. He got involved in the politics of empire. He thought a lot about the politics of empire. In fact, one of Guy Cordon's secretaries, a woman named Dorothy Jones, because of all these connections, had ended up living for quite some time in American Samoa. And Frank Herbert got absolutely fascinated by this. And he decided that what he really wanted to do was to be a colonial official in American Samoa. And he pushed very hard for this. So he pushed his boss, he pushed all of his other connections, the Secretary of the Interior, who he knew, and he just asked to be basically sent to American Samoa and just made, he would set up there and have a life as a writer. He didn't really have a vision for what he wanted to achieve with the colony. It was mainly a vision for the kind of life of leisure that he hoped to enjoy there. He did not get the post, partly because I think a lot of people perceived that he was not going to stay very long, and he had other ambitions that were going to take him very far from the colonies. But nevertheless, there was another way in which he got really involved with the United States empire and really interested in it. It's not just that the United States had an overseas empire of overseas colonies. Right after World War II, the United States had also declared sovereignty over the territory of the seabed. So the submerged lands that lie off the coast of the actual land that the United States had claimed. This is something that was a sort of pet issue for Guy Cordon, and it became a pet issue for Frank Herbert, who got really excited about this sort of aquatic imperialism and what could be done, what could be mined from this new territory that the United States had claimed. So he wrote an article exhorting people to be adventurous and to get in their submarines and start exploring this new land. It was going to be the new frontier to develop. As he put it, our new empire is the continental shelf. Not only did he write about this and, of course, work for Guy Cordon on this issue, his first novel, a not very frequently read these days book called The Dragon in the Sea, was entirely about this. It's a story, it's a Cold War story about submarines that are going and doing offshore oil drilling. And they're the heroes, right? The heroes are the people who are doing offshore oil drilling and are able to get resources, bring them back to the United States, exploit the underwater seabed. And that's what Frank Herbert was really excited about. If you've read Dune, this is a theme that you'll recognize, because a lot of Dune is about mining in hospitable conditions. Here in Dune, it's on a desert rather than in the seabed, but a lot of the same sense of adventure and danger carries over from one novel to the other. So that's one way in which, wow, okay, Frank Herbert is not just writing about empires in general, he's really got an empire in specific on his mind, and he knows quite a lot about it. But there's more. When I read Frank Herbert's biography, written by his son, Brian Herbert. So it has a lot of stories that Frank Herbert had told to his son. One story really just jumped out at me, and I immediately wanted to know more about it. It's a story that Frank Herbert told to his son about when he was young and when he was growing up in Washington State. And the story goes like this. One day when Frank Herbert was out fishing and hunting, which he was frequently, he came upon, and this is how it's said, an Indian man named Indian Henry, or at least named that way by Frank Herbert. The two became very close friends. Henry adopted Frank Herbert and taught him the ways of his people, and they were together for about 2 years, or they were often together in the woods for about 2 years. Indian Henry, I thought, oh my gosh, I would love to know that guy's story. And it was so frustrating in a way, because that's all he is in the biography, Indian Henry. And that's all he is that I've seen in Frank Herbert's papers. I couldn't find this guy's name. I knew that he was a member of the Ho tribe, but that was it. His name was Henry. Well, sometimes history gets really lucky, or sometimes historians get really lucky. We get lucky with the archives. The tribal roles of the Ho tribe are not very large. There's not a lot of people on them at this time period, and there's only one Henry. And by going through these, I was able to find out this guy's name. His name is Henry Martin. And, he's, and in the records, the person described as Henry Martin is born at, exactly the right time to be the right age. And not only was I able to, and he's also a fisherman, which is how he's described in the story. I was also able to piece together a little bit of his backstory because I found just one of these other really lovely finds, an anthropologist's account of the Quileute tribe and the Quileute Reservation in Western Washington. And before I do that, I should explain that the Hoh people, the Hoh community, is a band of the larger Quileute people. So there is two political entities, the Hoh tribal nation and the Quileute tribal nation, but there's a larger sense in which all of this is under the Quileute umbrella. And it was not unusual for Hoh people to live on or spend time on the Quileute reservation, as Henry Martin did. And the reason I know this is that we have an account from an anthropologist of what things were like on that reservation in the 1920s and the 1930s. And one of those accounts, it's a kind of harrowing account because it's a story of both government neglect and harassment by government agents. But extraordinarily, one of the people who is harassed and who ends up getting in a fight with a government agent is Henry Martin, who'd been living on the Quileute reservation, who got stopped in what very much seems like an illegal stop from an Indian agent who was working both as a teacher and the sort of cop, and also the judge. So he was not only stopped by this guy, he was also convicted or sentenced to 60 days hard labor, and he refused the sentence. This was a moment of defiance, not just for Henry Martin, but for the Quilliot community living on the reservation. Quickly led to some other moments of sort of conflict and defiance, and then a sort of collapse of relations between the U.S. government and the Quilliot nation that then led to a really hard time on the reservation and a lot of people moving away, as Henry Martin did. So in some ways, I was able to get this backstory and to realize that this wasn't just a sort of, Huck and Jim kind of thing where there's a, conveniently located Indian man just in the forest, just waiting to pass on his wisdom to a young teenager. This is someone who was in a kind of exile and who lived quite a difficult life and presumably passed a lot of that on to Frank Herbert in their 2 years together. We don't know what they talked about other than that Henry Martin explained how to kind of live off the land. But I think there's reasons to suppose, and I'll get into them in a second, that some of the political experience that Henry Martin lived through was also passed down to Frank Herbert. Frank Herbert got, at the same time as he's quite interested in the US empire, he was also really fascinated by the indigenous experience that was visible around him in Western Washington, and particularly in the Quileute world. Right after World War II, at a piano recital, he met another Quileute man named Howard Hanson, who grew up in the Quileute reservation and became, by all accounts, Frank Herbert's best friend. It's a little bit of a tricky thing. Howard Hanson grew up on the Quileute reservation and identified as Quileute, but oddly, he didn't have identified parents, so it's not unusual for a father to be unidentified. In his case, his mother was also unidentified, as far as anyone was willing to publicly say he was just a baby that appeared. But he grew up on the reservation and was identified by elders as someone who had a particular interest in history and particular interest in lore, and so was given fairly extensive training to become a sort of repository of the history and the lore of the Quileute people, and he took that quite seriously. He left the Quileute reservation after World War II, joined the Merchant Marine, traveled the world, kept in touch with Frank Herbert the whole time, and then came back in the 1950s and saw what he felt to be just a devastating change that had happened to the place where he'd grown up, the reservation. The Quileute reservation at La Push, that's the place name, is extremely heavily forested and is actually one of the wettest places on the North American continent. And he'd seen logging that had been taking place all around the reservation that had ended up drying a lot of, trees retain water, so a denuded earth retains a lot less water, and he felt like he was just seeing the place go from being, this healthy, wet place to a dried out, almost wasteland. And that's something he depicted in a book that he started writing, a book that he wrote, and as he was writing, he shared with Frank Herbert. It's called Twilight on the Thunderbird, and the Twilight is both the twilight of the reservation and the twilight of the Quileute people, and the sort of cultural dissolution that he thought would come with environmental destruction. The novel got published in 2018, very late, but he had to self-publish it right before he died, but he published it. And I've talked to his wife. The version he published is pretty much the version that Frank Herbert read and Frank Herbert edited. And it seemed like Frank Herbert took really seriously, because this account that Howard Hanson gave of ecological transformation, logging in Western Washington, that's an account that seeped into Frank Herbert's consciousness. How do we know that? Well, one way we know that is this. Frank Herbert got super interested in Quileute issues, and at the same time as he's imagining and writing the Dune series, he's also thinking through Quileute life, and he ends up by both his account, the account of his son, and the account of Howard Hanson's widow, whom I was able to interview. Frank Herbert was profoundly influenced by Howard Hanson's ideas. And in the 1970s, partly under Hanson's influence, he got really interested in red power activism taking place on the West Coast. And in the middle of his Dune success, so his first novel has come out, it's finally starting to sell, publishers want more Dune novels, he decides to put a halt to Dune-related activities so that he can write a novel that he describes as a sort of labor of love, a novel that he's desperately wanted to write for quite some time. And the novel is called Soul Catcher. It's the only non-science fiction novel that he ever published during his lifetime. It's a novel about Quileute politics. And it takes place on exactly the backgrounds that Howard Hanson had described. Logging, it starts with the rape of a woman by some white logger, of a Quileute woman by some white loggers. And it features a kind of relationship that is almost identical to Henry Martin's relationship with Frank Herbert. It's a older Hogue man who gets close to a young teenage white boy and shows him the ways of the forest and teaches him exactly the same lessons that we know that Henry Martin passed on to Frank Herbert. The difference is this: at the very end of the novel, the older man is trying to sort of use the younger boy to make a political point. He kidnaps him and wants to drive home what settler colonialism has done to the Quileute people, and he decides he wants to kill the young boy, so the stand-in for Frank Herbert, and the young boy lets it happen. So in some ways, Frank Herbert is imagining martyring himself to this cause as a way to express how serious he is about Quileute politics. It's not just that he writes this book with that very dramatic ending. He also, after publishing it, it doesn't sell very well, and he nevertheless is completely undaunted. Publishers are begging for more installments in the Dune series, and he says, actually, what I want to do is apply for a federal grant so I can do ethnographic research with Howard Hanson as my research assistant, and I'm going to go around Native communities gathering lore, and I'm going to write another novel about Native life in Washington, which he does. He can't get any publisher interested in publishing it. I have not been able to get my hands on a manuscript. But the point is that at the time when, Dune is so loud in his ears, all he wants to write about is Quileute politics and the politics of Native life in Washington. So question is, does this play into Dune, right? Does any of this show up in Dune, the novel? I think there are really good reasons to think, beyond the sort of general intellectual influence, that Dune is a way for Frank Herbert to think through a lot of these issues. So one reason to think so is that, both Frank Herbert's son and Howard Hanson's widow said that Dune was deeply influenced by Howard Hanson. And we have two accounts of this one conversation that's really extraordinary between the two of them. This happens well before Dune is written. Hanson says to Herbert, "White men are eating the earth. They're going to turn this whole planet into a wasteland like North Africa." And he's thinking about La Push. He's thinking about the Quilliot reservation there. And Frank Herbert responds, "Yeah, like a big Dune." This is a story that Frank Herbert told his son this is a conversation where Frank Herbert says, yeah, that's exactly right. And once you see that, you can kind of understand how Dune, which takes place on the driest planet in the galaxy, and it's a story of, well, among other things, the possibility that this dry planet might be, it was once wet, it's now extremely dry and inhospitable, and it might get wet again. You can see how all of that is a sort of play on this question of the Quilliot Reservation, which is one of the wettest places in the country, drying out, becoming denuded, becoming like a great big dune, but whether it could be restored. It's not just that the ecology of Dune seems, as far as I can tell, to be influenced by the Quileute experience, and particularly by what's going on at La Push. It also seems to me that the characters in Dune are based on these experiences. So the most intriguing characters in the Dune universe are the Fremen, who are the indigenous people of Arrakis. And, this kind of question of who they really are, who are they meant to represent. A lot of the language they use either is or sounds Arabic or Turco-Persian. So clearly Frank Herbert is making a lot of linguistic gesturing to the Middle East and to the Islamic world. But, I've gone through Frank Herbert's papers. He did not know a lot beyond the sort of armchair knowledge about the Middle East, and he wasn't particularly invested in Middle Eastern politics. He really cared about indigenous politics in Western Washington. And once you know that, it's not hard to see the Fremen also as a kind of, moisture reversed Quileute people, right? So the people of the driest place rather than the people of the wettest place. The Fremen also have a special relationship to these large, fearsome creatures that surf the sand dunes, the sandworms. They're enormous. And in that you can see some kind of connection or mapping of the Quilliot people, who had these also quite serious relations with large and fearsome animals that went through the Pacific coast. Whales. You can see the sandworms as a kind of land version of the whales. The reason I think this is so important, this connection, is that it's through the Fremen that all the really interesting stuff gets into Dune. Like the reason that Dune is a countercultural novel has a lot to do with the Fremen. And Frank Herbert was both very interested in indigenous experiences and interested in particularly the use of mind-altering drugs in the southwest of the United States, and had actually done peyote and some other mind-altering drugs before he wrote Dune. But he also saw Dune as a way to comment on a larger issue, which is a conflict between what he called Western man and some kind of other way of thinking about the world. So as he saw it, what Dune did, what made Dune so powerful, was that Dune was a rejection of Western man. And I think that you can see how a lot of the countercultural funkiness that comes into Dune comes from his engagement and is with indigenous politics. So now we're getting to a kind of weird part in the talk, which has to do with the fact that some people have read Dune at least 3 times and some people have not read it at all. I don't want to do a deep dive into the plot of Dune and how I see it mapping into all of these issues. I just want to say this. The whole Dune series, as I see it, is just an extended conflict between Frank Herbert's 2 political commitments. So on the one hand, Dune is a story of empires, and the empires never go away. Even when the empire is overthrown, it just becomes a new form of empire. And so, and Frank Herbert seems kind of committed to the idea that empire is a major, important, and possibly mandatory political form. And the extractive mission, right? The idea that going out to the far parts of the galaxy and getting difficult to find materials like seabed imperialism, that's a part that just does not go away in Dune. On the other hand, Dune is really haunted by the possibility of the loss of indigenous ways. It is very concerned with quote unquote Western man and scientific and technological ways that would sort of crowd out other ways of understanding the universe. So this is Frank Herbert's view of the relationship between indigenous and European. And throughout the novels just get weirder and they get more right-wing as they go, but you can see these 2 themes just sort of bumping up against each other throughout all the novels. And we can get into some of that in Q&A if you want to. I don't want to walk you through the plot of all of the novels, which total to about 2,500 pages all told. But I do want to end on a coda, or sort of a thing that I find sort of haunting about this. These issues feel not just interesting to me as a way to think about Dune, but sort of painful to contemplate because of the historical ironies they kick up. So I think once you've read Dune in context and understood a little more about Frank Herbert's world, you can see how there's a long Quileute shadow that is cast over Dune, which is kind of amazing because Dune is one of the most successful sci-fi franchises ever. The Quileute community is not particularly large. We're talking about less than 1,000 enrolled members in the tribal nation, and that reservation at La Push is about a square mile. So it's kind of amazing to think that such a small community has such an outsized influence intellectually over these set of novels that are so important. But it gets even more amazing when you know something else, which is that there is also a long Quileute shadow over another one of the most profitable sci-fi fantasy franchises, which is Twilight. I don't know who's read Twilight. I have not, I'll confess. But the Twilight novels are set in that same part of Western Washington where Frank Herbert had set Soulcatcher. And this came from Stephanie Meyer, who's the author of them, Googling for the wettest part of the United States and just glomming on to the same part of land. So they're set in Forks, Washington, which is the logging town that is closest to La Push, but they're also partly set in La Push because there's this group from La Push who are identified in the text as Quileute, who are werewolves. So all the werewolves in this Twilight franchise are from La Push and are from the Quileute reservation there. And the reason for that is that Stephanie Meyer, in her Googling, discovered the Quileute reservation and discovered that the Quileute community has a wolf-based origin myth and thought, I'll make them werewolves. And I mean, this has been a very bizarre thing for both Forks, Washington, but also, and more importantly, for La Push. On the one hand, it's been this incredible moment of visibility, especially as, La Push and, sort of the word Quileute have been suddenly on the lips of many teenagers. But it's also been, as you can imagine, kind of weird. So here are some, and there's a lot of this, there's some Quileute themed merchandise that is sold just by a number of Hot Topic and Nordstrom's and a number of other firms. So this allegedly Quileute insignia here is just made up. It's made up by the Twilight franchise, but it is sold as a sort of Quileute thing. And you probably won't be shocked to learn that none of the profits go to the Quileute nation. And so there's something kind of so frustrating about this that, as Fremen, as werewolves, the Quilliot have this like outsized influence, but there does not seem to be the commensurable interest in the Quilliot as subjects in their own right. And one reason I know that is that there have been repeated talks about making Soulcatcher, which is really about Quilliot politics, into a movie. In fact, right now there are plans to turn it into a movie with Chris Eyre, who's one of the most prominent Native directors, directing it. Howard Hanson, before he died, was signed on as a consultant and was going to work with them with the novel just to make sure that it really was getting the Quilliot perspective just right, which he worried that Frank Herbert hadn't quite done. And I've talked to Chris Eyre about this, and he says on the one hand, it's really exciting. It's a dark political movie that ends in a very weird way, which is with the Native man who's a kind of stand-in for Henry Martin killing the young guy who's a stand-in for Frank Herbert, and doing so out of a sort of act of political vengeance. And it's in that way a kind of peppery and difficult movie. And Chris's view is that it's a movie that it's going to be really hard to get made for that reason. So the other movies are so, just millions of dollars behind them. This is a movie that has basically been stalled, and it's been stalled in various incarnations for a number of decades. I said that there are some painful ironies here, and one of them is just to see how Quilliot ideas and Quilliot imagery get picked up in all these other movies and yet can't make it on the screen in a sort of more, own right kind of way. Another one is this. The big idea that Frank Herbert gets from Howard Hanson is the idea of ecological change. Howard Hanson is looking at what's happening to the Quilliot Reservation at La Push, and he's seeing wholesale transformation. And he communicates this to Frank Herbert. All accounts of what did they talk about, that's what they talked about. And then Frank Herbert sort of maps this square mile of lands onto a whole planet and imagines, what if it's not just a reservation? What if it's an entire planet that goes dry? What if it becomes, the entire planet becomes a sort of sand dune? That's the planet Arrakis. And, you know, Dune is powerful in a lot of ways, but one way this book is powerful is that this is the first book that gets people to imagine whole scale, you know, planets being terraformed. This is the first book that gets a lot of people to imagine climate change. And the Quileute Reservation, this fairly small place, becomes the microcosm by which Frank Herbert can see a much larger thing, or can imagine a much larger change going on. The reason this irony kind of just sticks in my craw, or this sticks in my craw as an irony, is that right now, the Quileute Reservation is deeply imperiled by climate change. It's not quite as Howard Hanson imagined, that the deforestation would lead to the place drying out and becoming a wasteland. It's rather that the deforestation has meant that the land just can't hold the moisture, so there's much more flooding at the same time as the climate warms, which is something that Howard Hanson didn't really imagine happening when he was writing about this in the 50s. That the coastal reservation is just getting battered and hit by waves, and the soil is eroding, and to the point where there are regular drills as the school children have to just practice abandoning the schoolhouse in case of very sudden flooding. And so this small bit of land that has become in some ways the model for Frank Herbert, who mapped it onto Arrakis and then allowed so many readers to map Arrakis onto Earth, the climate change of the Earth has effects all over the place, but one of the most poignant and kind of hard to contemplate effects is what it's doing to that one small square mile of land at La Push. Okay. Thank you so much for coming to this talk. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'd love to get into it in Q&A, so I'm happy to take it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was fascinating. As one of those people who has read Dune probably far more than 3 times, I will try to keep, from getting too far into the weeds of the details and everything, but I do appreciate all the context that you gave. And also the part about, Frank Herbert's first book and about the sort of the seabed mining reminded me that Dune actually starts with the Atreides family living on an ocean planet that they control, and then are moved to this dry planet that they are then assigned to by the Empire. So that's kind of some fascinating context for that move. So thank you for that. I would say, monitoring the chat, that the majority of the questions, or at least the most questions, seem to kind of touch on the issue of white saviorism, and how Frank Herbert saw himself in relation to the indigenous people that he was learning from, how that plays a role, obviously, in Paul Atreides, the hero of Dune, being a white guy who learns and then leads the indigenous people that he encounters. If you could talk a little bit about that, and how the Quileute today view Dune, how they view their portrayal, if they have any connection to it, and if they have any feelings about it in particular.
I think that question about white savior politics is exactly the right question to ask. So in Dune, there's a sort of exaltation of Fremen ways, but the guy who really gets you there is the off-world hero, Paul Atreides. It's not the Fremen themselves are not major protagonists. They're major characters, but they're not major protagonists in that sense. And so Paul basically, and this is the term that Frank Herbert uses, goes native. And he takes a Fremen concubine and he takes a Fremen name, but he's also still himself, right? And there's a really important way in which he does not surrender his identity, his off-world identity. And I think we can map that onto a sort of white or Western identity in Frank Herbert's mind. And that's one of the sort of discomforting things about Dune, is that it tends to use indigenous people as a backdrop for the character transformation of the, mapped onto white protagonist. And I think that's, something a lot of people have found sort of puzzling, perhaps exciting, but also a little discomforting about Dune. I think Frank Herbert was interested in that question of where he fit as the descendant. He describes his stand-in character in Soulcatcher as an immigrant invader, someone who's very sympathetic and gets very interested in Quileute culture, but never can quite get there. And so I think he was also interested in what his role was supposed to be in any of this. And the fact that in Soulcatcher, the way he resolves it is by having his stand-in just martyred, is on the one hand, a different kind of resolution to, leading the Quileute hordes against the Galactic Empire. On the other hand, as Chris Harris pointed out, it still makes the white guy the center of the story. And there's a way in which the white character is always centered in all of this, no matter how sympathetic portrayals of indigenous people are.
Great, thank you for that answer. I think another one of the common questions that we've been seeing is about Frank Herbert's politics. Did he move from the right to the left? As you mentioned, he got, as the Dune books progressed, they get more feudal, they get, sort of more conservative in their governmental structure. They lean towards the Messiah complex. Where were Frank Herbert's politics, do you think? How'd they shift?
Yeah, they definitely, I mean, the important thing to recognize is that he starts out on the right. I mean, this is not a move rightward. The politicians he's working for are very seriously conservative. And he is, the fact that Richard Nixon is campaigning for Frank Herbert's mentor, basically, gives you just a sense of it. But Herbert it's not, I don't even know if he moves further to the right or if he just gets less interested in parables and just wants to say the quiet part out loud. What is weird about the later novels is that, I mean, they are set, what is it, like 2,500 or 25,000 years in the future. And the characters who have some kind of ancestral memory that they can like recall the distant past, keep thinking about Earth politics in the 20th century and keep like mentioning it. So like there's a moment when someone's describing a scientific concept that involves the word liberal, like used in a scientific technical way. And one of the characters is like, oh God, I'm sorry, you just made me think about the 20th century on Earth and how liberals are so awful and they just want to tax everyone and they use Social Security to get people on their side, but really they just prey off the middle class. I'm sorry, go on, were you explaining something? So it's like that kind of thing. And so on the one hand, this might seem baffling, right? You're like, how is someone who is so sympathetic to indigenous people also so like anti-government libertarian right wing? But in some ways it goes together, right? Because as Frank Herbert sees it, the main predator that is a problem for indigenous people is also the main predator that is a problem for his bank account, which is the federal government. So there is a kind of back to the land autonomy politics that is countercultural, right-wing, highly sympathetic to a reading of what indigenous culture is all about, and actually somewhat consistent. So, yes. So he's a sort of right-wing version of the counterculture, and I think that he finds strains in indigenous life and indigenous politics that seem to work perfectly well for him in that regard.
I wanted to know, this is my question, sorry, if you had read the works of Ursula K Le Guin, who was also heavily influenced by indigenous peoples. Her father was an anthropologist working in California.
Yeah.
Yes. And but wrote very different stories that had I would say a complete antipathy to empire. They were societies that were set up entirely differently. And very notably in one of her last great speeches, accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award, said, "We live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words." I was wondering if you had done any work contrasting or studying their two approaches.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah, I haven't done any research on that. I've read her stuff, and you're quite right. I mean, and I think that just shows that Frank Herbert takes the politics of his fascination with an indigenous life in one direction. That is not a mandatory direction. That is a chosen direction, and Le Guin just goes in the other way and just shows you the possibility on the West Coast for people who are roughly contemporary of each other. And by the end of his life, Frank Herbert he moves to, first of all, he's dodging the IRS this entire time. He moves to a fairly remote part of Hawaii and identifies as one of the natives of Hawaii, but he's still like a lifelong member of the NRA and a supporter of Ronald Reagan. So, and a forthright defender of capitalism. So he ends up in a different place.
We do have a new question here that ties in with something that I wanted to ask you also, which is about the role of women and gender roles in Dune, and whether you had gone into that at all. For those who are not familiar with it, there is an order of nuns called the Bene Gesserit, who are sort of behind the scenes in the Empire, somewhat opposed to, but trying to basically pull the strings from their position. And so there's a lot of, I think, interesting stuff about reproductive choice that comes up in relation to that, in terms of women leaders, women both in the indigenous side and on the empire side. So I was wondering if you had touched on that at all.
It's amazing. A lot of this sci-fi stuff from, the mid-century or a little after, I mean, they can imagine distant planets, they can imagine spaceships, but gender roles are going to have to be the same. And that's not to say that Frank Herbert does nothing with that, but it is remarkable. He makes a lot of room for female characters and sometimes female heroes, but there is, at least in the early novels, a very clear sense of, the women work by poison, the men work by sword fights. The women sort of manipulate power behind the scenes and use sex to do so, and the men are heroic and, have battle plans and that kind of thing.
Right.
The most interesting thing for me was, it just was so complex that I didn't resolve it, is the politics around sexuality. So Dune is kind of actively homophobic. The villain in Dune doesn't just have a Russian name, so that's the Cold War context, but is a pederast, and is just like, looking for young men to sexually assault. And that's part of his villainy. And then, and all the stereotypes that go with it. He's sort of just, physically repulsive, has a desire that's uncontrollable. And Frank Herbert wrote about homosexuality in a really, forthrightly negative way. And his son was gay. His son was not only gay, but was an activist, was a member, joined the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence in the Bay Area, and died quite early of AIDS. And so I've interviewed the kind of surviving family of choice of that son who died, who were able to fill in some of that story there. And it's just a very difficult relationship between a son who is also scientifically minded, is also very interested in like sci-fi and technical stuff, and a father who never really accepted him, and then would write highly public fiction in which the villains are homosexuals. So that's, I mean, it gets even weirder in the later novels, but that's something that interested me quite a lot.
I've got a question from Danny here about how did Herbert square his sympathy for indigenous peoples and their plight, at least in the United States, with his support for imperial policies that devastated indigenous peoples in other parts of the world, and did he think at all about this contradiction? He portrays, his indigenous heroes here very heroically, as you point out. And seems to lament that the white men are eating the earth, but then he embraced these very imperial projects at the same time.
Yeah, I think he never worked it out. And I mean, he described his books. The first book he was eager to explain. And he said, okay, there's a moral, here's the moral, and he would explain it in interviews. By the end, he said it's just an Escher lithograph. It's like themes come and they turn into paradox, and they turn in on each other. And I think one reason why the novels have that weird structure where heroes become villains and projects, that you're very invested in one novel get undermined in the next, has to do with the fact that he can't politically work it out. And so, first, the Fremen take over the entire galaxy, and then they turn Arrakis green again. So they rejuvenate it. But then they realize that once they've done that, they've lost their indigenous ways. So then they have to turn it back. And, like Arrakis just keeps accordioning back and forth, and he never quite works it out. And part of the problem is that he's quite sympathetic to indigenous people when they are weak and persecuted. But then whenever he imagines them winning, then he gets sort of upset about it. And then they become villains, and they're no longer really, tough, and they're no longer hardy, and they're no longer living off the land. And so they no longer have the qualities that he likes. And then so he has to kind of start the cycle over again.
Mm-hmm. Would it be safe to say that he has sort of a preoccupation with demagoguery? and power differentials throughout. I mean, with Paul,
Yeah,
with the Fremen, with
absolutely. So, I mean, one of the weirdest things about Dune is that at the end of the first novel, you think, oh, this Paul guy, he seems lovely. Like, what a great hero. And then in the second novel, he turns into Hitler. And Frank Herbert was like, yeah, I just wanted to show you how quickly, you could like a politician and they could turn into a total tyrant, like JFK. That's who he kept mentioning. But part of that, what's interesting is that for someone who's deeply concerned with tyranny and demagoguery and power and power imbalances, the one thing he can never imagine is liberal democracy, right? It's never just an inclusive welfare state where everyone's getting along. And I think part of that is that, looking at the federal government from a Quilliot perspective, there's not a lot of excitement or inroads to have, successful participation in, politics within a liberal frame and a welfare state, as if, indigenous peoples were just like minority citizens. So yeah, Dune just keeps cycling through all of the political alternatives, except one where people just vote for representatives. That's the one that he can never abide.
Sounds awful. Just a truly dystopian future. We had another comment about specifically, you'd mentioned that, Herbert is modeling this largely off the Quileute land, but he's sort of writ large. But obviously a lot of people make the connections to the Middle East and spice as oil, as the sort of the fuel that runs the universe. We have a comment that Herbert includes those Middle East references because he lifts a lot from T.E. Lawrence and Wilfred Thesiger's travel writing in the Arabian Peninsula, which is, sort of the British imperialists. Did you look into that angle of it at all, the kind of international imperialism?
Yeah, and again, this is the book report that got out of hand. When I started, I assumed that I would just be reading a lot about the Middle East, and I'd be able to fill in the gaps. And it's quite obvious that this substance, spice, that is so important is oil. And of course, Herbert's first novel was about oil extraction. He thinks a lot about oil extraction, and so that kind of puts him in oil plus desert. He's already in the mindset of the Middle East, and he did a lot of reading about that, including he read Lawrence's Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and you can map the sort of white savior Paul Atreides story onto the story of Lawrence of Arabia. And in fact, Lawrence of Arabia had just come out as an Oscar-winning film the year before Dune started appearing in serial. So, I mean, that kind of reference was available to a lot of people. What just struck me going through the Herbert archives was I expected the Middle Eastern stuff to be really deeply thought, and it just didn't seem like he had a lot of the sort of linguistic decoration and some of the ethnographic detail, but he didn't seem to have any kind of deep interest in the politics of the Middle East. And so the more I read of him, the more I realized that Western Washington was the real context for a lot of this. Or, obviously everything, it all feeds in, but it struck me that Western Washington was what was central in his mind.
Yeah, well, the Middle East is a very boring place anyway. No one cares about that. It's not like anything happens there, Let's see. Someone wants to know if you have anything published further on any further explanations or explorations of Dune and Frank Herbert for fans of the book to read, or do you have anything in the works?
Yeah, I mean, it started out as just a magazine piece for N+1. I sent them something, so hopefully that they'll print something. But
you have your frequent shopper card.
Yep, someone's got
seems like we're getting a little crosstalk. But I'm also doing a larger academic article, and I've talked to editors at the Washington Post about a shorter version of this, timed with a movie.
Interesting. All right.
99. Place your item in the bag.
Someone appears to be checking out. Yes. Can everyone please make sure that you are on mute before we continue? Thank you very much. Someone else also wanted to know if you saw parallels with Faulkner's The Bear, with its theme of ecological degradation and a young boy learning from an older Indian who was the last of his tribe.
I hadn't particularly thought about that, but that literary trope of the young boy learning from the old native man, that felt, frankly, I thought it was made up at first when I read it. And until I actually tracked down, quote unquote, Indian Henry, I was I just assumed that maybe he like ran into a guy one day or something, but I had a hard time imagining that this relationship was actually as described. So, and that's because it seems like such a literary cliche. But once I was able to fill out Henry Martin's story, it made me and see how Frank Herbert had kind of clearly been thinking about it when he was writing Soulcatcher. I started to think it was both plausible, but also realizing that relationship was not just learning the ways of the forest, but it was probably learning some kind of indigenous political perspective.
As someone who spent her formative years in, say, like maybe the 80s, and did a lot of babysitting and saw a lot of bookshelves of middle class white woman during that period that I was not necessarily supposed to look at, I'd be fascinated in your analysis of the romance novel tropes of the time, which leaned heavily on the white woman kidnapped by savage indigenous man theme. So that's I'm giving you that for free. That's another research topic.
There's a long literary history of a lot of this kind of stuff.
I'd be interested in hearing if you have more on kind of the crossovers between Dune and Star Wars, which is obviously a very popular franchise also, and the various influences there.
Yeah, so I mean, it was clear at the time. So Frank Herbert went to see Star Wars and immediately, started preparing his lawsuit, and wrote down a list of all the things that he'd identified, and some of them are just quite obvious. The fact that it's a dry planet where there's moisture farming in Star Wars, and is pretty relates quite clearly to the kind of activities they're doing on Dune to conserve water. But I think actually more interesting is the differences between the two. Dune is really hard to film, it turns out, and Star Wars, it just writes itself at this point. And I think a lot of that has to do with the politics of them. So Dune has a really cranky and weird politics, and the further you get into the novels, the more that becomes the case. Star Wars has bright lines morality. There are the good guys and there are the bad guys, and it's interesting what the morality is, right? Especially by the third film, where the rebels side with the Ewoks, who in George Lucas's understanding were the Viet Cong fighting against the United States. That's a surprising kind of film to make in the 80s, but nevertheless, once you're in the film universe, it's really clear who to identify with, how to identify with them, and that you're just rooting fully for them. Dune never gives you that. The first novel is kind of a literary ambush. You're supposed to root for Paul, but then you're later told how stupid you were to root for him. And then all the later novels just keep undercutting that, I think, because Frank Herbert has, on the one hand, Empire as a project, on the other hand, Indigeneity as a project, and you just can't resolve the two. George Lucas doesn't seem to be politically troubled in that kind of way.
That relates to a question we just got in from Lauren Baker, who says, referencing Le Guin again, that Le Guin says that every utopia contains a dystopia and vice versa. Dune's dystopian elements seem pretty obvious. Is there a utopia on the flip side for some of the characters or perspectives, or was Herbert just unable to make that big work?
Yeah, there's talk that he was setting it all up for a final seventh novel where he was finally going to actually realize a political vision that he endorsed. But we never got there. He died, and that novel never got written. It's not that everything is dystopian in the world he describes. It's just that everything is unsettled, and there's a constant interest in unsettling and in you think this is a good idea, but it turns out to be a bad idea, so you have to rethink it. He was also really influenced by Zen, and his interpretation of Zen meant that you were always kind of surrendering to randomness, rejecting plans that you had laid, and you can see in Dune a kind of affirmation of people who can improvise, go with the flow, surprise themselves.
So his son Brian then kind of takes over the series long after the sixth novel. Yeah. He kind of tries to reinvigorate the series. Now, is this the same son or a different son from the one you were speaking about earlier, who was gay and had these difficult experiences with his father growing up?
Yeah, there are two sons. One is Bruce, who he's the one who dies, and the other is Brian, who just comes to feel like he's he's the heir to he's the literary heir. He's also the financial heir. And he ends up writing a biography and writing like 12 more Dune novels. His Twitter handle is Dune Author. So he regards himself as the author of Dune. And fans there's like a split between the orthodox Herbertarians who reject the later novels as non-canon, and people who are willing to consider them as extensions of the Duneverse. That's where you end up. But it's been interesting that like so much of the Dune franchise has been just controlled by this one guy who has special access because he's the son who also is the biographer, et cetera, et cetera.
Interesting. We have a couple of questions actually that have come up about Avatar in relationship to Dune, whether spice is equivalent in some way to the unobtainium on Avatar, and whether you think Herbert would have also prepared a lawsuit against Avatar with its storyline about a white human soldier who goes to another planet on a mission of resource extraction and conquest, and instead goes native and leaves the righteous indigenous people in their battle against the forces against them.
Yeah. I mean, look, here's a really interesting thing about US culture is that by the 60s, there are a lot of movies and major novels that are in some ways about empire, and they clearly have some relation to the United States, and usually they're intensely critical. I mean, that's an interesting thing, that there's these hugely popular anti-imperial movies like Star Wars, like Dune, not a movie, like Avatar, and we can, a lot of them have a sort of finesse it by having a white savior, so they're not affirming the rebels against empire as much as the like people who defect from the empire and then lead the rebellion, leading the Ewoks, leading the Fremen, whatever. But it's absolutely extraordinary that the pop culture of the United States is so decidedly anti-imperial, and yet the foreign policy of the United States has not seemed to adjust. So there's a sort of perpetual state of dissent, and a quite popular dissent. So, I mean, if you try to extrapolate politics from what moviegoers like, you'd think that this is a really anti-imperialist country. And then if you were trying to extrapolate what voters want from, U.S. foreign policy, you might end up at a different conclusion. And I mean, one reason I was just so interested in all of these movies is just trying to square that circle to figure out how culture and policy relate in that way. But you're right. Cameron that's a really anti-imperial film. I mean, that's not saying there's no problematic politics of it, but like it's clear where the animus is. And unobtainium is, just another version of oil or rubber or, whatever kind of colonial extractive product.
The MacGuffin of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What do you see as Herbert's perspective on technology as a societal force?
Yeah, it's interesting. He does a very weird thing in Dune, which actually gets picked up in Star Wars. He sets Dune in a world where technology is basically forbidden. There's this prehistory to the universe in Dune where they had a moment, not really explained, where they just decided that computers were a terrible idea. So it's a space like setting thing where there are no computers and no robots. Then they still have like laser guns and atomic weapons, but no one is allowed to use them because there's a kind of mutually assured destruction going on. So basically they're all poisoning each other and going at each other with knives. And I mean, that's the tech, there's still spaceships, but that's basically the tech in Dune. And technology was one way in which Frank Herbert thought through these issues of indigeneity and culture. He got really kind of nervous that technology would take over from how people were thinking and would create a sort of inorganic way of life. And so Dune is one response to that. In the later Dune novels, they come to be more accepting of technology. Frank Herbert actually, he was very much a back to the lander, but he was also a tinkerer. So he would patent, solar technologies and different, farm technologies. He described himself as part of the techno peasantry. And then really oddly, he got very excited about one technology, which is the personal computer. And he decided that this was like the weapon of libertarian liberation. If everyone had a personal computer, the government wouldn't have these like mainframes. Everyone would just have their own computer. So also at the height of Dune fame, to what must have been the enormous frustration of his editors, he put the Dune train on hold yet again to write a computer user's manual. Like you just like how to use a computer by Frank Herbert. You can get it on eBay.
That's amazing, and I'm going to have to look that up now.
Yeah, yeah.
So do you envision him now in the role of Twitter troll as a?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think that Frank Herbert. I mean, I think the reason the books are coming back is that it used to be that the counterculture was left and the right played it straight, right? So that the right wing stood for, you know, going to church, family values, not doing drugs, that kind of stuff. And the left, you know, was much more tolerant of all those things. We are now in a world where there is a countercultural right wing where you are, I mean, you're seeing it in all kinds of ways. So, I mean, not that he's so far on the right, but, you know, Elon Musk basically just trying to escape the planet, you know, and going to space in some techno-libertarian dream. Elon Musk is a major Dune fan, and his partner Grimes named her album after a Dune, had a reference to the Dune books in it. You know, we also have just, you know, the incels of 8kun beaming government conspiracies through the ether. I mean, that's like all of that is a rejection of family values, rejection of the establishment, rejection of government. And then you have sort of Odin worshippers, heavily armed and militias, you know, trying to take over the government to protest mask regulations. That's a world that Dune recognizes. Like, this is the countercultural right, and so that's why I think Dune is just coming up in the in the zeitgeist. Is it because it actually maps out a lot of these politics of a right wing that rejects the establishment rather than just a left wing that does.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That's been very fascinating. Daniel, Danny, do you have any further questions, or does anyone have anything else? Now's your chance to put them in the chat here.
Yeah, you'll have a couple minutes because I have a couple of minutes worth of closing thoughts. One, it was inspired by your comment about Twitter, Lorena, because I forgot to mention in my introduction that amongst Professor Immerwahr's many accomplishments and noteworthy writings, he's on Twitter. He was on pause when I started following him on Twitter. It was sort of anticlimactic because I hit follow and then I saw I'm on Twitter. Your pinned tweet was like, I'm on Twitter hiatus until I finish my next book. So I've never actually seen any tweets of yours. But a colleague of mine raves about your Twitter, your Twitter prowess. I mean, he was rhapsodizing for like 20 minutes about how cool your tweets are. So I just want to give a shout out to Professor Immerwahr's Twitter cogitations. Where can people find you on Twitter, Dan?
Yes, I'm not actively on it, but at D, my first initial, D Immerwahr, my last name. No, that's the Twitter handle. Yeah. Okay. Apologies for whatever you're going to read there.
Not Dune author. It's not that.
It's not Dune author, right?
Mm-hmm. I did have one. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, Lorena, go ahead.
I just I forgot I did not get to Beatrice's question about native sci-fi and fantasy authors. Daniel, I don't know if you have any that you particularly recommend. I know I recommend Rebecca Roanhorse as an Indigenous author who writes Indigenous-based sci-fi and fantasy, who's very popular right now. She's got a new book called Black Sun, I think, that's just about to come out. She has a series called Trail of Lightning that she's been working on for a few years now. And Beatrice, if you want to drop me, if you want to just send me a private message, I'm happy to work on it a little bit and get you a list of recommendations also.
And I think one reason why it's important to say that is that sci-fi as a genre has really been resistant to a lot of voices that weren't white and male. And it's a genre that kind of came out of Empire and has sort of endorsed it along the way. So it's really amazing to see just in the last 10 years, like Cambrian explosion of sci-fi from every perspective. And I mean, the genre is growing, is getting funkier and weirder, and it just doesn't have the same sort of like, you know, this is a future in which everything is handled robotically, except that women are still secretaries kind of vibe that it used to.
Yeah, it has been fascinating the past few years, as you've said, to see the sad puppies war, the rabid puppies wars. You know, there's been this big divide in which direction science fiction should go. between like a very open and inclusive and from every direction versus like, if it's not white dudes who are fighting space monsters, then it's not real sci-fi. Yeah.
Right. I had one question that occurred to me while you were in the course of answering someone else's question, Daniel, that is way too long to have typed into the chat box. So I'm just going to throw it out there. When you were talking about how for Herbert, you know, there are all these quasi Middle Eastern allusions, raucous. But when you actually investigate the record, there's not a lot of there, right? He didn't actually know that much about the Middle East, didn't seem terribly preoccupied with Islam. When you made that point, it really reminded me of something, if this isn't too tangential, Samuel Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations. There was a Middle East scholar from Ireland who lived in London by the name of Fred Halliday. Not sure if you knew his work, but when the Clash of Civilizations came out and there was this huge debate about Huntington and the book, Halliday was the only scholar I read who made this very interesting point. He thought, forget about what Huntington is saying about Islamic civilization and the Middle East. He doesn't know anything about the Middle East. The book he just stole a couple of ideas from Bernard Lewis. What fundamentally what Huntington is talking about in this cosmic language is really his own racial anxieties about the United States becoming a more brown country. And a lot of people dismissed Halliday's observation as like, what are you talking about? Huntington is an international relations guy. He deals with U.S. foreign policy, not domestic U.S. issues. And Halliday said, mark my words, it's all about the U.S. And about 5, 6, 7 years later, Huntington's final book came out, which was titled, Who Are We? And it was precisely a meditation on his racial anxieties about the United States becoming more Hispanic and less Anglo. And he basically says the quiet part out loud. He says, we are fundamentally an Anglo-Protestant culture. And the rise of Spanish and all this immigration is destroying our identity. And even many of Huntington's followers and admirers were very uncomfortable with this. Like Francis Fukuyama wrote this very critical review of it, and Huntington had been his teacher. All these people who loved Huntington had to distance themselves from this because it was kind of proto-Trumpian. But I say all of this, I mention this episode about how basically Halliday's insight was verified by Huntington's final act, if you will. And it really reminded me of what you were saying, that in a sense, for a lot of these people who think big cosmic thoughts and deal with other planets and huge first order questions, at the end of the day, it comes down to right here at home, right? And I don't know if you see any parallels between Huntington and Herbert in that sense, but that's what you made me think of when you made that point.
Yeah, and the way you described it in Huntington's case is quite a negative one, right? He tries to describe the world, all he can, describe is his backyard, is the way you sort of put the case. Sci-fi is always doing that, right? It's always extrapolating, right? It's always imagining, okay, let's see what I'm seeing around us or what I'm thinking about. Let's imagine this taking place in the larger world. I don't think that's a fault of it. I think that's a really exciting feature of the genre. And I mean, to me, it's not a ding on Herbert that he was able to, take so much of what was happening in Western Washington and blow it up to the galactic scale, and really try to sort out its implications. That's an interesting way to think through a set of problems. It's an interesting way to think through a historical situation or episode. So that part of it doesn't bother me at all, but it is just a reminder that, yeah, when sci-fi authors give you these sort of wonderful, weird worlds, there's usually something behind it. I mean, that's not a sinister thing. It's just, there's something there that they're really responding to. They're not just making things up. And I was delighted to find, just as a researcher in Herbert's case, how specific some of that stuff really was.
Fabulous. Well, I want to thank Professor Immerwahr for his generosity of time and intellect in sharing his analysis with us this evening. I want to thank the Evanston Public Library for its longstanding partnership with the Center for International and Area Studies at Northwestern. And I want to thank Lorena Neal in particular for always bringing an extraordinary adroitness in her moderation of these events. And I want to thank everyone who zoomed in tonight for this fabulous discussion. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope that you'll continue to zoom in for these events as long as we're forced to hold them on Zoom. And then eventually one day when we gather back at the Evanston Public Library on the corner of Orrington and Church. But I think this was a really great event, a stimulating discussion. And thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, Professor Immerwahr.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thank you very much. Join the Sci-Fi and Fantasy Book Club.
Indeed.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night, Lorena.